The wind howled across the endless white, a sound as ancient as the earth itself. Darkness pressed against the horizon, unbroken but for the faint shimmer of moonlight upon ice. In that world, warmth was not just comfort, it was survival. A fire could mean the difference between life and death, a spark against the vastness of cold eternity. And yet, humanity endured. Against glaciers that carved mountains, storms that scoured plains, and nights that stretched into weeks, they found secrets, fragile, ingenious, sometimes desperate, that allowed them to live where no creature should. These forgotten methods, etched in bone, smoke, and memory, are not just remnants of survival, but proof of our oldest resilience. They whisper to us, even now across millennia, reminding us of how thin the line between life and extinction once was. If this story stirs something in you, an echo of the struggles of those who came before, then join us on this journey. Like, share, and subscribe, not as a distraction, but as a way to carry these voices further, to keep alive the fragile flame they once fought to protect. The first breath of winter was not a gentle chill, but a consuming force, sweeping across plains and valleys like a living predator. For the people who dwelled in those days, the Ice Age was not a distant concept or geological term. It was the air they breathed, the ground they walked, the endless weight pressing against their every thought. When the sun sank behind the horizon, when shadows deepened into an unbroken shroud, the night became a second enemy. Cold sharpened into spears of frost, and silence swelled until even the faintest snap of twigs outside the camp could conjure dread. These nights were long, merciless and indifferent, but somehow humanity endured them. Survival began with fire. A single spark was both shield and weapon, its light keeping beasts at bay, and its heat standing guard against death's icy grip. But fire was a fragile ally. If wood grew scarce, or if wet snow smothered the flames, the night could swallow entire families. Men and women learned to nurse embers as though they were children, covering them with ash to keep their glow alive until dawn. It was a knowledge passed not in words, but in instinct, an unbroken chain of wisdom stretching backward through countless winters. That secret, how to keep the ember alive, was the difference between shivering through the night or never waking at all. The shelters they built were not homes in the way we think of them today. They were fragile defenses, hides stretched over bone frames, caves sealed with stones and brush, snow itself carved into protective walls. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, animal fat burning in lamps of carved stone, the smell of sweat and damp fur clinging to every surface. Children pressed against their mothers, their small breaths fogging in the dim glow. Outside, the wind clawed at the walls, searching for a way in. But within those walls, however thin, a flickering ember held the power of life itself. Predators were everywhere, the dark eyes of wolves reflected from beyond the firelight, watching, waiting for weakness. Lions, larger than any known today, prowled the frozen plains. Even mammoths, lumbering and immense, carried danger within their size. A single charge could destroy both hunter and shelter alike. For early humans, every sound in the night was a question. Was it the wind? Or was it the death that crept just beyond the fire's edge? Each howl carried across the ice was not just a reminder of what lurked outside, but a test of courage. It was in those moments, when fear pressed down hardest, that people discovered resilience they did not know they hid. Yet the night was not only terror. It was also a forge of intimacy. Families huddled together, warmth shared through closeness. In that darkness, voices whispered, stories grew, and the first threads of memory began to weave. A mother might hum a low tune, her voice a soft vibration against the storm. A father might carve patterns into bone, not for beauty, but for rhythm, a small reminder that time still moved forward. In the most fragile hours, when the wind seemed certain to erase them, humans discovered that togetherness was itself a survival tool. Solitude meant death. Connection meant endurance. But deprivation gnawed constantly. Cold drained strength, hunger thinned faces, and exhaustion clouded judgment. Fire could be guarded, but it could not be eaten. And so, even in the depth of night, minds turned to food. A strip of dried meat, brittle as bark. A pouch of frozen berries, their taste sharp as iron. Every bite was weighed, every mouthful balanced against the days yet to come. The uncertainty of tomorrow was as sharp a predator as any wolf outside. The greatest secret of those nights was not a tool, nor even a structure, but knowledge carried silently across generations. How to start flame from stone, how to insulate a shelter with moss and snow, how to track stars through a break in clouds to know when morning might come. These were not luxuries, they were lifelines. Children absorbed them as naturally as breathing, because forgetting meant extinction. Each secret was not a choice, but a necessity, one thread in a fragile web holding humanity above the abyss of endless night. And still, despite fear and cold, there was beauty. The stars above stretched like frozen rivers across the black sky, dazzling in their silence. The auroras rippled like spirits dancing at the edge of heaven, their green and red veils swaying in a rhythm older than words. To the eyes of those who endured, these lights were more than celestial accidents. They were omens, guides, perhaps even promises. For people who lived one night away from death at all times, such visions were not dismissed as illusion. They were woven into the fabric of survival itself, reminders that even in the coldest dark, there was mystery, there was wonder, and perhaps there was meaning. As the fire crackled and shrank, as families pressed tighter against each other, there was no certainty of dawn. Each night could have been the last, and yet against the odds, they endured. They learned that survival was not strength alone, not fire alone, not knowledge alone, but all of these woven together. The edge of night was always near, but it did not claim them entirely. It shaped them instead, carving endurance into their bones and memory into their voices. So begins our journey into the forgotten secrets that let humanity endure when the world itself seemed set against them. Secrets that turned fragile sparks into blazing endurance, that taught small bands of wanderers how to carve out survival against cold eternity. And as the first night passes in our story, we move toward hunger, another shadow that pressed in with equal force, waiting at the threshold of every cave, every shelter, every ember's glow. The cold could gnaw at the skin and stiffen the breath, but hunger reached deeper. It hollowed out the body from within, leaving a constant ache that was sharper than any wind. In the Ice Age, when nights stretched longer than memory and storms buried the land beneath white silence, hunger was the truest predator. Fire might keep death at bay for a few hours, and shelter might shield the skin, but without food, the body wasted, the mind dimmed, and hope itself grew thin. At the threshold of survival, hunger was always waiting. To eat was not a guarantee. Each day began with uncertainty. Each dusk ended with fear of emptiness. Hunting was a dangerous gamble. A band of men might follow mammoth tracks across frozen valleys, their feet breaking through crusted snow, their breath rising like ghosts in the dim light. They carried spears tipped with stone, tools that seemed laughably fragile against a beast towering over them like a moving mountain. Yet hunger drove them forward, for to return empty-handed was not an option. Failure meant not just disappointment, but days of gnawing stomachs, the sharp cries of children too weak to sleep, and the steady decline toward death. Not every hunt was grand or glorious. More often, survival depended on the small things. The twitch of a hair in the brush, the faint trail of reindeer, the unexpected chance of scavenging from a predator's kill. Nothing was wasted. Sinew became rope, Bones became tools, marrow was cracked out with stones and licked greedily. Even the thick hide of beasts was chewed, softened by fire and spit when nothing else remained. Hunger taught them to see nourishment where others might see refuse. It forced them into innovation, stripping away the illusion of choice until only necessity remained. Women carried secrets of their own, no less vital than the hunt. They knew where roots might be dug from beneath snow, where berries could be found in rare thickets shielded from frost. They dried herbs, smoked fish, and buried food caches beneath stone to keep them safe from scavengers. Children were sent to gather what little could be found. Pine needles to brew into a bitter but life-saving drink. Moss to line storage pits, frozen eggs left behind in a half-forgotten nest. Every hand, however small, was drawn into the war against hunger. But there were times when even the wisest eyes could find nothing. Then, hunger became a haunting presence. Faces grew gaunt, eyes sank into shadows, and conversation shrank into silence. Those who once sang around the fire now conserved breath. Each crack of bone in the distance, each howl in the night, reminded them of the thin divide between predator and prey. In desperate winters, when herds migrated beyond reach and stores ran dry, stories were whispered of terrible choices, of what people might do when food was gone, when survival demanded the unthinkable. Whether these were truths or warnings, no one could say for certain. But the fear of famine pressed into the mind as much as the cold pressed into the flesh. Yet even in hunger, there was strategy. Food was rationed with ruthless precision. A strip of dried meat was cut and divided, measured against the smallest hands, shared with the knowledge that every mouthful had to last. Mothers often ate last, sometimes not at all, ensuring that the children's strength would endure even if theirs faltered. Leaders rose not by command, but by sacrifice, giving up their share to prove their worth. Hunger reshaped society into something both brutal and tender, brutal in its demands, tender in the bonds it forced. Hunger also birthed ingenuity. Traps were laid with increasing sophistication, pits dug and disguised with branches, snares strung between trees, bait placed with cunning patience. Hunters learned to read the land like a story, each track a sentence, each broken branch a clue. They became interpreters of silence, able to see what moved hours before and predict what might pass hours later. In this way, hunger sharpened not just the stomach, but the mind. Survival required more than courage. It demanded foresight, memory, and invention. But hunger was not only physical. It gnawed at the spirit, shaping beliefs and rituals. Around the fire, offerings were sometimes burned, pieces of fat or marrow cast into the flames, gifts to unseen forces in the hope of favor. Hunters painted animals on cave walls, not only to recount hunts, but perhaps to summon abundance. Hunger turned imagination into faith, and faith into practice, as people sought to explain why some nights yielded food and others did not. It was not foolishness, but necessity, for belief itself could give strength to bodies too weary to rise. In those nights, a single successful kill could transform despair into triumph. The moment a carcass was dragged into camp, voices rose, fire crackled higher, and life surged back into hollow faces. Children laughed, elders smiled, and the air filled with the smell of fat sizzling on hot stone. Hunger, for a moment, was defeated. But always, just beyond the circle of light, it waited. No feast erased the memory of famine. No meal erased the knowledge that tomorrow the hunt would begin again. The secret of enduring hunger was not in abundance, it was in resilience. To endure gnawing emptiness, to stretch scraps into sustenance, to fight despair even as bodies weakened. Hunger taught humanity how to bend without breaking, how to adapt without surrender. It was a cruel teacher, but its lessons etched survival into the very marrow of our kind. As the night wore on, as scraps were saved and bones cracked open for the last drops of marrow, the fire dimmed and the sounds of the camp settled into uneasy silence. The embers glowed faintly, their warmth mixed with the ache of half-filled stomachs. And beyond the thin walls of hide and bone, something moved, a shadow with eyes that caught the light, a reminder that hunger was not humanity's battle alone. Predators, too, prowled in the endless snow, driven by the same desperation. The boundary between hunter and hunted blurred in that frozen world, and as dawn threatened to rise, the true test began. To survive not only hunger, but the beasts of frost that stalked those who starved. The silence of the Ice Age night was deceptive. Beneath its stillness, the world was alive with eyes, claws, and teeth. For every human huddled in the fragile safety of firelight, there were predators lurking just beyond, watching with hunger as sharp as the cold. To survive was not only to guard against frost and famine, but to endure the relentless presence of beasts who ruled the frozen plains. The Ice Age was their kingdom, and humanity was an intruder clawing out a fragile claim within it. Wolves were the most constant companions in this hostile land. Their howls carried across valleys like voices of the storm itself, low and haunting, echoing in the bones of those who listened from their shelters. These were not the wolves we know today, sleek and cautious, but larger, more feral, creatures bred by ice and scarcity. They hunted in disciplined packs, circling the edges of firelight, eyes glowing amber in the dark. For humans, they were both curse and mirror. Wolves taught them the power of cooperation, of reading signals, of moving as one. To study wolves was to learn survival, but to encounter them too closely was to risk everything. Many a child was told in hushed whispers that the eyes outside the fire belonged to spirits who tested the brave, and perhaps, in some sense, that was true. Yet wolves were not the only predators. The great cave lions roamed with silent grace, beasts larger than any modern lion, their paws sinking into snow without a sound. They needed no howl to announce themselves. Their presence was terror enough. A single lion could scatter hunters, could drag a man screaming into the dark with the ease of wind through grass. Unlike wolves, lions had no interest in teaching lessons of unity. They were shadows of raw power, forces of inevitability. To see one was often to see it too late. And still, against reason, humans dared to follow them, to study their movements, to learn where their prey might gather. To track a lion was madness, yet hunger made madness necessary. The mammoths, too, loomed as both danger and salvation. They were not predators, but their sheer size and strength made them gods of the plain. A mammoth's trumpet could shake the air like thunder, and its charge could crush both man and shelter beneath unstoppable weight. But mammoths also meant food, more food than a tribe might see in an entire season. To bring down such a beast was nearly unthinkable, requiring coordination, courage, and desperation in equal measure. Fires were lit in lines to funnel them, spears rained down from hunters who risked being trampled in the snow. Success meant feasting, hides for warmth, bone for tools, and fat for fire. Failure meant crushed bodies, wasted energy, and bitter hunger. To face a mammoth was to gamble life itself, but the reward was the promise of survival carved in flesh and bone. There were other creatures too, shadows that haunted the imagination. Saber-toothed cats with fangs longer than a handspan, their strike quick and silent. Hyenas, their laughter carrying across the plains like a cruel mockery, bold enough to challenge even lions. Bears that emerged from caves with the strength of storms, drawn by the scent of meat and the promise of fire. Each encounter was a negotiation with death, each night a wager against the eyes gleaming just beyond the circle of light. Humanity was never alone, never unobserved, never unthreatened, and yet, in the presence of these beasts, people found more than fear. They found reflection. The animals were not simply enemies, they were woven into the fabric of human survival. Every predator taught something. From wolves, unity; from lions, stealth; from mammoths, endurance; from saber-tooths, speed. To survive was to imitate, to borrow strength from those who had ruled the land long before humans dared to walk it. Over time, these lessons bled into culture. Animals became spirits, symbols, guides. The great hunters painted their forms on cave walls, not only as memory, but as invocation, as if to honor them was to gain their power. In this way, beasts of frost became more than enemies. They became teachers, shaping the evolution of the human spirit. And still, the lessons came at a cost. Many lives were lost in those encounters, names forgotten to time but carried forward in the fear etched into every ember's glow. A child taken by wolves, a hunter mauled by a lion, a family crushed beneath the weight of a mammoth. These tragedies carved themselves into memory, retold as stories not only of grief but of warning. Do not wander beyond the firelight. Do not mistake silence for safety. Respect the beasts, for they are older than us. Such warnings were not just fear, they were survival itself, distilled into words and passed like fire from one generation to the next. The night always sharpened these lessons. Within the shelter, when the fire crackled low and shadows danced upon the walls, every sound became amplified. A distant growl, the crunch of snow, the soft thud of heavy paws moving unseen. Each noise was a reminder of vulnerability. Sleep was shallow, dreams uneasy, for any moment could be the moment when the wall of bone and hide gave way to the claws of something outside. And still, people endured, because to falter meant extinction. In the end, the beasts of frost were not simply threats to be feared, but boundaries to be tested. They forced humanity to grow sharper, braver, more inventive. They reminded them that survival was never given, only taken, earned, night by night, wound by wound. The eyes in the dark were always there, waiting, teaching, challenging. And because of them, humanity learned to adapt. Because of them, the fragile flame of survival burned brighter. But even as the beasts circled, and even as hunger pressed deeper into the bone, there was one force more enduring than claw or fang. The glow of fire and the stories that rose with its smoke. Beyond survival, beyond the body, there was a new kind of endurance beginning to form, something that lived not in flesh but in memory. As dawn broke and the shadows of predators retreated, humans gathered not only to eat and plan, but to tell. And it was in those stories, whispered and painted, that the next secret of endurance began to take shape. The fire was more than flame. It was a heartbeat, a gathering place, a fragile boundary against the endless dark. To watch it crackle in the stillness of night was to feel alive, for its glow turned terror into warmth, chaos into rhythm. Fire was not just survival, it was memory. Around it, voices rose, shadows danced, and humanity began to shape itself into something more than mere survival. It was in the glow of firelight that story was born. In those frozen landscapes, fire was first a tool, then a teacher. At the most basic, it provided warmth, light, and safety from the beasts whose eyes glimmered just beyond the circle of sparks. But fire also gave space for thought. When the hunt was done and hunger quieted for a few hours, when the beasts prowled outside but dared not enter, humans gathered close and began to speak. Their voices wove together into something larger than any one body could carry, the collective memory of a people. It began with recounting. A hunter described how the mammoth fell, how the spear struck, how courage or luck saved the day. Others listened, children wide-eyed, elders nodding with recognition of patterns they had seen before. These were not idle tales. They were maps of survival, lessons encoded in narrative. Through story, the young learned the shape of danger, the rhythm of the hunt, the secret paths across snow. To forget was to die. To remember was to endure. Fire became the keeper of memory, and story the vessel that carried it forward. But story did more than instruct. It gave meaning to the unexplainable. The auroras that rippled across the sky, the storms that swallowed whole valleys, the dreams that haunted exhausted sleep, all found form in words. Spirits were named, forces given shape. A whisper in the night might be explained as an ancestor's voice, guiding or warning. The groan of shifting ice became the growl of a hidden beast. To clothe the unknown in story was not ignorance but survival. Fear without form is paralyzing. Fear with a name can be faced. Thus myths grew like fire-fed sparks, illuminating shadows too deep for reason alone. Around the fire, bonds deepened. Laughter mingled with caution, grief with wonder. A mother comforted her children with a tale of heroes who braved the frost and returned. An elder told of times when winters were harsher still, reminding listeners that they were not the first to suffer, nor would they be the last. Each voice joined the fire's crackle until the night was no longer silent, but alive with shared memory. This was survival of a different kind, the survival of spirit. The very act of storytelling transformed the cold. In a place where bodies froze and beasts killed without hesitation, story allowed people to imagine beyond their immediate fear. They began to see themselves not only as prey, not only as survivors, but as part of something larger, a clan, a people, perhaps even a thread in a greater pattern they could not yet name. This imagination, born from firelight, was itself a forgotten secret of endurance. When the body weakened, story strengthened. When the stomach ached, memory fed. The walls of caves still bear witness to this ancient revelation. Hands pressed ochre and charcoal to stone, drawing lines that shaped animals and hunters in motion. These images were not mere decoration. They were extensions of story, silent companions to the spoken word. To paint a mammoth on a cave wall was to fix it in memory, to honor its strength, to call upon it for guidance. To leave a handprint was to declare, I was here, I endured. In this way, fire and story reached beyond survival into legacy, carrying voices across thousands of years. Rituals grew in the same glow. Hunters might cast fat into flames before leaving for the chase, a silent offering to whatever force watched over them. Dancers might move in flickering shadows, imitating the leap of prey, the strike of a predator, the courage of a hunter. These acts blurred the line between survival and meaning. Was it superstition, or was it a method of remembering, a way to carry lessons in rhythm and gesture? Perhaps it was both. To dismiss it as mere ritual would be to overlook the truth. These acts gave courage to the fearful, unity to the many, and hope to the hopeless. But fire was fragile. A storm could sweep through and scatter sparks. A misstep could smother embers in ash. If flame died, so did story, for no one gathered in darkness. The struggle to protect fire was not only physical, but spiritual. When one group encountered another, they sometimes traded embers as gifts more valuable than meat or tools. Fire meant more than warmth. It meant continuity of voice. And when people moved across frozen plains, carrying embers in stone or bark, they carried their stories as well, cradling them against the winds that sought to erase them. It is no exaggeration to say that humanity's survival hinged as much on fire and story as on spear and shelter. For it was story that gave fire meaning, and fire that gave story life. Without them, survival would have been mere existence, cold, hungry, and without memory. With them, life became something more. Even in the harshest of nights, when hunger gnawed and beasts prowled, there was still a spark of wonder, still a reason to endure. As the flames burned low and the voices quieted, shadows clung to the walls, shifting like restless spirits. The night beyond was still vast, still dangerous, still hungry. But within the circle of light, there was warmth, there was memory, and there was hope. Humanity had found a way not only to endure, but to imagine. And imagination, once kindled, would never be extinguished. Yet with imagination came fear of what lay beyond sight. Whispers grew of things in the ice, shapes half seen in storms, voices carried on the wind. Were they beasts, spirits, or something else entirely? Fire gave people the courage to tell these stories, but it also gave them the courage to believe. And as the next chapter unfolds, we step into that realm of rumor and shadow, where survival meant not just fighting beasts and hunger, but reckoning with mysteries no spear could pierce. The Ice Age did not only test flesh and bone, it tested the mind. For when fire dimmed low and the winds swept against thin walls, there were moments when silence itself seemed alive. Shapes flickered in the frozen mist, voices drifted on the storm, and humanity began to wonder if the world was shared not only with beasts of tooth and claw, but with things unseen. Out of hunger, cold, and fear grew whispers, rumors of spirits that walked the ice. A hunter returning from the chase swore he had seen a figure move against the snow, tall as a tree, cloaked in frost, vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. Another spoke of hearing a child crying on the wind, though no child had wandered from the camp. These were not stories meant to entertain, but warnings whispered in low voices, carried like embers from one generation to the next. The world was too harsh, too strange, to believe that only the visible existed. For every cave lion or wolf, there might be another presence, invisible but no less powerful. When storms howled for days without end, their voices seemed more than mere air. The groaning of glaciers, the cracking of ice, the thunder of avalanches, such sounds became language to those who listened long enough. Some believed the earth itself was alive, shifting in pain or anger. Others thought the voices belonged to ancestors, warning their descendants not to stray too far from the safety of flame. Whatever the truth, people leaned into belief, for in it they found a kind of shield. To name the unknown was to survive it. In the deepest caves, where light scarcely touched, shadows stretched into monstrous forms. With flickering torches, walls seemed to breathe. Some painted the beasts they feared, as if to trap their power in pigment. Others pressed hands against stone, leaving red outlines that marked their presence to unseen eyes. Were these acts prayer, defiance, or both? Perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was that belief gave courage where reason faltered. To think that spirits walked beside them was terrifying, yes, but it was also comforting. If the world was filled with forces unseen, perhaps those forces could protect as well as destroy. Not all whispers were of terror. Some were of guidance. Hunters told of dreams in which animals revealed themselves, showing paths to prey or warning of ambush. Women spoke of visions while tending fire, flames flickering into shapes that hinted at futures yet to come. Children, with eyes unclouded by years, claimed to see figures in the snow that vanished when adults approached. Whether imagination or truth, such tales carried weight, shaping choices, turning hesitation into action. Even rumor could become survival when followed. Yet with belief came danger. Fear of spirits could splinter unity. If a child grew sick, was it illness or punishment from the unseen? If a hunt failed, was it poor skill or angered forces in the ice? Guilt and suspicion crept easily into minds wearied by hunger and frost. Offerings were cast into flames, beads laid upon snow, prayers murmured to the darkness. In desperate moments, people sought bargains with things they could not see, trading what little they had for a chance at mercy. Whether these acts saved them or not, they gave them strength to endure another night. The landscape itself seemed alive with rumor. Ice shaped into towers, sculpted by wind, appeared like frozen sentinels watching from afar. Caverns groaned as though beasts slumbered beneath the earth. The auroras above shifted like veils, too beautiful, too strange, to be without meaning. For people who walked each day at the edge of death, the world was thick with presence. Nothing was empty. Everything spoke. To survive required listening not only with the body, but with the imagination. And in time, these whispers became the roots of myth. Spirits of ice, guardians of fire, voices of the dead. These tales were not carved into stone with idle hands, but with trembling ones. They told of dangers remembered, of mysteries endured, of lessons clothed in shadow. In every rumor was a survival strategy, however veiled. To say, "Beware the spirit in the storm," was also to say, "Do not wander in the blizzard." To whisper of a shadow beyond the fire was to remind others never to stray too far into the dark. Rumor was not weakness, it was a way of binding wisdom into memory. But as rumors grew, so too did reflection. If the world was filled with spirits, what did that mean for humanity itself? Were they watched, judged, and measured? Were they alone in their struggle, or part of something vast, unseen, eternal? These questions took root beside the fire, flickering with every spark. And though answers never came, the act of asking itself was transformative. To imagine spirits was to imagine meaning. To imagine meaning was to imagine purpose. In this way, whispers in the ice carved not just survival, but the beginnings of belief, faith, and philosophy. The nights of rumor were long. Some whispers vanished like smoke, others lingered, carried across generations until they hardened into story. Even now, faint echoes remain in myths scattered across cultures, fragments of voices first spoken under the glow of Ice Age fires. The spirits of the ice may not have been real in form, but they were real in influence, shaping choices, guiding behavior, and carrying fragile humans through the abyss of fear. As dawn broke after such nights, the world seemed both sharper and more fragile. The storm might pass, the shadows might fade, but the memory of what was heard, what was half seen, clung to the mind. The Ice Age was not only endured in flesh, but in imagination, where rumor gave shape to the unknowable. And from this union of survival and story, something profound began to emerge. A philosophy of endurance, a reflection not only on how to live, but why. The final chapter carries us there, into the ember's glow, where memory and meaning entwine. Survival was never only about fire, food, or fear. It was about reflection, what it meant to endure, what it meant to be human at the edge of extinction. And so, as the whispers fade into silence, we turn to the ember's light and listen to what it still has to teach. When the long night receded and only embers glowed faintly beneath layers of ash, silence fell across the camp. Not the silence of absence, but a silence filled with thought. After the storms, the hunger, the beasts, and the whispers of unseen forces, there came a stillness in which people could reflect, not merely on what they had survived, but on what survival meant. The ember's glow was more than warmth. It was a mirror. And in that fragile light, humanity began to see itself. Each ember was a reminder of what had been endured. It told of sparks carried across frozen plains, of hands cupped against wind to protect a flame, of nights when one fire sustained an entire clan against the cold. To stare into its pulse was to see more than fire. It was to see memory. The faces of those lost flickered in its glow, as though the flames carried not only heat, but spirit. And so people began to wonder, were they keeping the fire alive? Or was the fire keeping them alive? Survival was no longer just the act of eating or sheltering. It became a question of meaning. To endure night after night without reflection was to live like the beasts that prowled the dark. But humans, fragile though they were, carried something else. The ability to remember, to imagine, to find purpose beyond the struggle. The ember's glow gave space for that purpose to take form. It allowed people to ask why they survived, not only how. Perhaps it was in those moments of reflection that the earliest philosophies took root. The wind outside might be an enemy, but it could also be a teacher, showing the limits of strength. Hunger was a curse, but it also carved patience and discipline into the spirit. Predators brought fear, but also courage and respect. Even the whispers of spirits in the ice taught humility, reminding people of mysteries too vast to master. In the ember's light, survival was reimagined not as defeat of the world, but as dialogue with it. Humanity was learning that endurance was not a battle against nature, but a partnership with it, fragile and necessary. Children, gazing into the fire, heard stories that were more than warnings. They were lessons about belonging. The beasts, the storms, the spirits, they were not merely obstacles, but part of a shared existence. To paint a mammoth was not only to mark a hunt, but to honor a kinship. To whisper to the flames was not only to plead for luck, but to acknowledge forces beyond the self. Survival became more than endurance. It became relationship with the land, with the animals, with the unseen. The ember's glow also sparked a different kind of reflection, the awareness of time. Unlike beasts, humans could imagine the past and the future. They could recall nights when others had endured worse storms, and they could imagine mornings when their children might face gentler skies. This awareness was itself a survival tool. It gave reason to persist, even when the body ached. If the ember burned still, then tomorrow was possible. If tomorrow was possible, then the fight for survival was worth the pain. In this way, the ember's glow was not only physical, but symbolic. It was continuity. One flame carried forward meant one memory preserved, one lesson passed on, one chance that the fragile thread of existence would not be severed. Fire was not only life, it was lineage. And so, to guard it became a sacred act. The forgotten secret was this: endurance was not just about keeping flesh alive, but about keeping memory alive. Humanity did not survive the Ice Age only because of what they ate, wore, or fought, but because of what they remembered, shared, and imagined. There were, of course, doubts and sorrows. For every ember saved, another flame was lost. Families vanished in storms, hunters did not return, children succumbed to hunger. The ember's glow was also a reminder of fragility, of how thin the line was between life and death. But even in grief, the fire held space for reflection. Mourning became part of survival, for in grieving the lost, the living renewed their bond to each other. Even despair, when shared in the glow, could become strength. As the Ice Age wore on, and as generations turned, the ember's lessons deepened. It was no longer enough to endure one night. People began to dream of seasons, of cycles, of futures beyond their own. They began to plant meaning in the soil of survival, and from it grew culture, ritual, belief, and philosophy. Around the ember's glow, humanity ceased to be merely surviving animals. They became remembering beings, imagining beings, beings who could shape not only their tomorrow, but the legacy of their kind. The forgotten secrets of endurance were never truly lost. They live still in the instincts that guide us, to gather, to share, to speak, to remember. When we light a fire, when we tell a story, when we pass knowledge to those who come after, we echo those nights when survival hung by the thinnest thread. We do not remember the faces of those who first learned these secrets, but we carry their endurance in our bones. Every comfort we have today is built upon their relentless will to endure. So, as the ember glows in its quiet rhythm, we can imagine them, huddled together against endless night, telling stories that stitched fear into wisdom, turning rumor into myth, and carving survival into legacy. They endured not because the world was kind, but because they were relentless. And in their endurance, they gave us the world we now hold. The ember's glow fades, but its memory lingers. From it rises not just smoke, but the story of humanity itself. To endure the Ice Age nights was to prove that even in the harshest dark, there could be light, and in that light, meaning, and in that meaning, survival, not only of bodies, but of souls.